I was visiting Chicago for the weekend to catch up with some old friends and just have a good time. We had plans to check out some cool spots, grab food, and basically relive our college days. I booked an Airbnb in Wicker Park thinking it would be a great place to stay. The apartment was cozy, stylish, and in a great location. Everything seemed perfect. One night, after a day out exploring, I got back to the Airbnb pretty late. My friends had decided to call it a night early, so I was alone. I was just chilling on the couch, scrolling through my phone, and decided to send some Snapchats to my friends to show them the apartment and the view from the balcony. Nothing unusual, just the typical stuff. As I was taking snaps and sending them, I noticed something strange. In one of the snaps, there was a faint reflection of a person in the window behind me. It was really faint, so I thought maybe it was just a weird trick of the light, or maybe something outside. I didn't think much of it and kept snapping and sending more. A few minutes later, I got a Snapchat from my friend Lisa. She replied to the snap with the reflection, asking me who was in the apartment with me. That's when I started feeling a bit uneasy. I replied that I was alone, but she insisted that there was definitely someone in the reflection. I looked at the snap again, and my heart started racing. The reflection was clearer now, a shadowy figure standing behind me, looking directly at the camera. I jumped up from the couch and turned around, but no one was there. The apartment was empty. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the entire apartment, every room, every closet, but found nothing. I locked all the doors and windows and decided to try and sleep it off, thinking maybe I was just tired and seeing things. The next day, I met up with my friends and told them about the snap. They were freaked out, but tried to make light of it, saying it was probably just a glitch or something. We had a good laugh, but deep down, I was still on edge. That night, back at the Airbnb, I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. I decided to check my Snapchat memories to see if I could spot anything else weird. As I was scrolling, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In another snap I took earlier, the same shadowy figure was in the background, but this time it was closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, standing in the hallway, almost blending into the shadows. I was terrified. I knew I wasn't imagining things now. I decided to leave the apartment and stay with my friend Mike for the rest of my trip. I didn't tell the Airbnb host about the weird stuff because I didn't want to sound crazy. I packed my stuff in a hurry and got out of there. When I got to Mike's place, I showed him the snaps. He was just as freaked out as I was. We tried to rationalize it, but there was no logical explanation. I ended up deleting the snaps because I couldn't stand looking at them anymore. I don't know what was in that apartment, or if it was just some bizarre coincidence, but I'm never staying in an Airbnb alone again. I still get chills thinking about it. Last fall, I decided to take a break from my hectic life and spend a weekend in Portland, Oregon. I found this quaint little Airbnb in a charming neighborhood called Alberta Arts District. The place was a small studio apartment attached to an old Victorian house, and it looked perfect for a peaceful getaway. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the host, Emily, greeted me warmly. She gave me a quick tour of the place and some recommendations for local spots to check out. The studio was cozy, with a small kitchenette, a comfy bed, and a large window overlooking the garden. It felt welcoming, and I was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. After unpacking, I decided to take a stroll around the neighborhood. Alberta Street was vibrant, full of quirky shops, cafes, and street art. I had dinner at a nearby restaurant and then grabbed some groceries for the next couple of days before heading back to the Airbnb. That evening, I settled in with a book and some tea, enjoying the quiet. Around 9 p.m., I received a notification on my phone. Emily had left me a message on the Airbnb app. She apologized for any inconvenience, but mentioned that she'd be out of town for the weekend, and that if I needed anything, I should contact her neighbor, Dave, who lived in the main house. I didn't think much of it, and went back to my book. A little later, I heard a faint knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I felt a bit uneasy. I opened the door to find Dave standing there, a tall man in his 50s with a friendly smile. He introduced himself and said Emily had mentioned I might need something. He seemed nice enough, so I thanked him and assured him I was fine. He wished me a good night and left. The next day, I spent most of my time exploring Portland. I visited Powell's City of Books, wandered through the Saturday market, and had some amazing food. It was a perfect day, and by the time I got back to the Airbnb, I was exhausted. As I was winding down for the night, I heard footsteps outside my window. Remember, this time it was no longer about just noises. This was very different. I peeked out and saw Dave in the garden, doing something with the plants. It seemed odd for him to be gardening so late, but I brushed it off, figuring he was just a night owl. I woke up early the next morning, planning to go for a jog. As I was leaving, I noticed something strange. A small patch of freshly turned soil in the garden right outside my window. It looked like something had been buried there recently. My curiosity was piqued, but I didn't want to seem nosy. After my jog, I returned to find Dave in the garden again. This time, he was digging up the same spot. I couldn't resist asking him what he was doing. He seemed startled but quickly recovered, saying he was just moving some plants around. Something about his demeanor seemed off, but I didn't push it. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard more noises coming from the garden. It sounded like digging again. I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. I decided to confront Dave the next day and find out what was really going on. The following morning, I woke up early and went outside. The patch of soil was undisturbed, but I noticed a small, partially buried object nearby. I dug it up and found an old, rusty metal box. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a collection of odd items: an old pocket watch, some coins, and a small, faded photograph of a woman. I was confused and a little scared. What was Dave doing with these things, and why was he burying and unburying them in the garden? I decided to call Emily and ask if she knew anything about it. She didn't answer, so I left a message explaining what I'd found. Later that day, as I was packing up to leave, Dave knocked on my door again. This time, he seemed more agitated. He asked if I had seen anything unusual in the garden. I played dumb, saying I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. He seemed relieved, but still on edge. As soon as he left, I grabbed my stuff and got out of there. I drove to a nearby coffee shop and waited for Emily to call back. When she finally did, she sounded worried. She said Dave was an old family friend, but had been acting strangely since his wife passed away a few years ago. She apologized profusely and assured me she would deal with it. I left Portland that afternoon, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. I never found out what Dave was really up to, and I didn't want to. I gave Emily a good review because she was a great host, but I warned future guests about Dave and the weird garden incidents. I decided to take a solo trip to Denver to get away for a bit, do some hiking, and clear my head. I booked this cute little Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood near downtown. The reviews were mostly positive, and the pictures made it look cozy and well-kept. The host seemed friendly in our messages, so I thought everything would be fine. I arrived in Denver in the late afternoon, grabbed my rental car, and headed to the Airbnb. The house was a small, single-story place with a little garden in the front. It looked just like the pictures, and I felt good about it. I got the keys from the lockbox and let myself in. The place was tidy and nicely decorated, but I noticed it felt a bit off right away. It was too quiet, almost like the house was holding its breath. I brushed it off as travel nerves and started unpacking. After settling in, I decided to check out the neighborhood and grab some dinner. When I got back, it was already dark. The street was quiet, and there were only a few lights on in the nearby houses. I locked the door behind me and settled on the couch to watch some TV before bed. That's when things started to get weird. I kept hearing faint noises like soft thumps and creaks coming from different parts of the house. At first I thought it was just the house settling or maybe the old plumbing. But then I started to hear what sounded like footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, and I could feel my heart rate spike. I paused the TV and listened closely, but the footsteps stopped. I convinced myself it was my imagination and tried to focus on my show. A little while later, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, like they were right outside the living room. I was really freaked out by this point. I got up and checked the hallway, but it was empty. I looked around the house, checking the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. Everything seemed secure, so I went back to the living room, trying to calm down. The rest of the night I kept hearing those noises. It was like someone was moving around the house, but every time I went to check, there was nothing there. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next day I tried to shake off the feeling and went out hiking. I was determined not to let my imagination ruin my trip. But when I got back to the Airbnb, the weird vibes were still there. I tried to relax and made myself some dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, the noises started up again, but this time they were louder and more frequent. I could clearly hear the footsteps, doors creaking, and what sounded like someone rummaging through drawers. I was terrified. I texted the host asking if there was any chance someone else had access to the house, but I didn't get a reply. I decided I couldn't stay there another night. I packed up my stuff in a hurry, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I was leaving, I noticed a small door in the hallway that I hadn't paid attention to before. It was partially hidden by a curtain. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I didn't want to stick around to find out what was behind it. I left the house and drove to a hotel, where I finally felt safe enough to get some sleep. The next morning, I called Airbnb support and explained what happened. They were sympathetic and refunded my stay, but I never got an explanation from the host. They said the house was supposed to be empty and they had no idea what could have caused the noises. To this day, I have no idea what was going on in that Airbnb. Maybe it was just an old house with a lot of creaks and groans, but it felt too deliberate, too human. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. If you're ever in Denver and book a cute little house near downtown, be careful. You might not be as alone as you think. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Just a week off to relax and explore the city. I booked a highly rated Airbnb in South Congress, a trendy neighborhood known for its shops, restaurants, and music venues. The place looked amazing in the photos. A cozy guest house in the backyard of a larger home, complete with a private entrance and a small patio. I arrived in the early evening and was greeted by the host, a friendly guy named Mark. He showed me around, gave me some local tips, and then left me to settle in. The guest house was as charming as I'd hoped, and I felt pretty good about my choice. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk and grab some dinner. South Congress was lively, with lots of people out and about, and I had a great time exploring. By the time I got back to the Airbnb, it was close to 10 p.m., and I was ready to unwind. As I entered the guest house, I noticed a slight draft, which seemed odd since I was sure I had closed all the windows before I left. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I'd just forgotten one. I double-checked and closed the one that was slightly ajar, then settled on the couch to watch some Netflix. About an hour later, I started hearing faint noises from outside, rustling leaves, the occasional creak, and what sounded like footsteps on gravel. The guest house was pretty secluded, so I wasn't too worried at first, thinking it might just be animals or neighbors. But the noises persisted and grew louder, sounding more like someone walking around the backyard. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The footsteps seemed to be coming closer, moving around the side of the guest house. I felt a surge of anxiety and decided to take a look. I got up, peeked out the window, and saw nothing but darkness. The yard was empty. Trying to shake off my unease, I went back to the couch. But a few minutes later, I heard a distinct tapping on the window behind me. My heart raced as I slowly turned around. There was no one there, but the tapping continued intermittently. It sounded deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I texted Mark, asking if anyone else had access to the backyard, or if there were any scheduled maintenance visits. He replied quickly, assuring me that no one should be there and offering to come over and check things out. I thanked him, but decided to wait it out a bit longer. I didn't want to overreact if it turned out to be nothing. The noises stopped for a while, and I managed to relax a bit. But around midnight, they started up again, footsteps, rustling, and that persistent tapping. This time it was more intense, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt a strong sense of being watched, and every hair on my neck stood up. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The backyard was dimly lit by a street light in the distance, casting eerie shadows. I scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of movement near the fence at the far end of the yard. It looked like someone quickly ducking out of sight. Panic set in, and I rushed back into the guest house, locking the door behind me. I called Mark and told him what I saw. He sounded concerned and said he'd be over in a few minutes. While I waited, I kept hearing faint noises outside, but I stayed put, too scared to investigate further. Mark arrived shortly after, flashlight in hand, and did a thorough check of the property. He didn't find anyone or anything out of the ordinary, but he could tell I was genuinely freaked out. He offered to let me stay in the main house for the night, which I gratefully accepted. I barely slept, constantly listening for any signs of movement. The next morning, Mark apologized profusely and offered me a full refund and assistance in finding another place to stay. I ended up moving to a hotel for the rest of my trip. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.